It started as an ordinary day, a grey London morning, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes the city feel heavier somehow. I didn't set out to reopen a murder case from 70 years ago. I wasn't chasing headlines or trying to prove anyone wrong. I simply wanted to understand how a young woman called Ruth Ellis became the last woman hanged in Britain. Her name flickers through our history books like a whisper, half legend, half tragedy. Everyone knows the headline, Hostess Shoots Lover. Executed at Holloway. But few know the woman behind it or the world she lived in. When I first stumbled across her story, it wasn't the crime that caught my attention. It was the silence that followed. No outrage in the courtroom, no delay in the gallows. Just a swift sentence and a nation that moved on. Yet something about it didn't sit right. So I began to dig. Old newspapers, court transcripts, letters from people who had long since passed away. And the deeper I went, the more I realized this wasn't just the story of one woman's crime. It was a story about Britain itself, a country caught between old laws and changing times, between mercy and morality. Today, her story feels almost impossible to imagine. But in 1955, it happened in plain sight. This is the story of Ruth Ellis, the last woman hanged in Britain. When you start piecing together Ruth Ellis's life, the first thing that strikes you is how unremarkable it seemed at the beginning, ordinary, almost humble. Ruth was born Ruth Nielsen in Rhyl, North Wales in 1926. The youngest daughter in a working-class family, she grew up during a time when hardship wasn't the exception, it was the rule. Her father, Arthur, was a cellist who found himself working odd jobs when the music dried up. Her mother, Elisabetta, was of Belgian descent, quiet and hard-working, trying to keep the family steady through uncertain years. By the early 1930s, the Nielsens had left Wales for London, like many families looking for better prospects. They settled in the capital's grey outskirts, a world of terraced houses, ration books, and neighbours who knew each other's business. London was still nursing its wounds from the Depression and later from the Blitz. Brick dust, patched windows, and the faint hum of recovery filled the air. It was in those streets that Ruth grew up, quick, bright-eyed and ambitious, though school never held her interest for long. She left formal education young, not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. There was money to be made, and the family needed it. Her first jobs were modest, waitress, clerk, then a model for a local photographer. In post-war London, glamour was currency. Young women who could smile for the camera or charm a customer in a club had opportunities that others didn't. It was a fragile kind of independence, one earned on charm, wit, and resilience. By the late 1940s, Ruth had found her place in that world, the smoky basement bars and nightclubs of Soho and Knightsbridge. It was here that she first met the kind of men who could change your life overnight: racing drivers, businessmen, musicians, men with cars, confidence, and money. She worked at clubs like the Court Club in Duke Street, eventually becoming a manager. To her friends she was lively, sharp, and fiercely loyal. To the press, years later, she would be painted as the archetype of post-war temptation. But that's too easy. The truth is, Ruth Ellis was a young mother doing what she could to get by. She'd married George Ellis, a Canadian who drank too much and hit too hard. They had 2 children, one of whom she sent to live with relatives for stability. The marriage didn't last, and by the early 1950s she was back in London, alone but determined to make something of herself. The clubs gave her a kind of stage, the soft light, the music, the steady rhythm of conversation and cocktails. She was known for her looks, platinum blonde hair, red lipstick, always dressed to the nines. But there was more. beneath the surface. Those who knew her said she was intelligent, controlled, and rarely lost her temper. In the world of post-war nightlife, appearances were everything, but in Ruth's story, they would also be her undoing. If you want to understand what happened on that April night, you have to understand David Blakely, or at least the kind of man he was. When Ruth met him, sometime around 1953, London was changing fast. The old wartime austerity was giving way to a new kind of energy. Jazz, nightclubs, cars, freedom. It was a world where people were desperate to live again after years of rationing and restraint. Ruth, with her striking looks and quick wit, was part of that new London. And so was David. Blakely was the opposite of Ruth in almost every way. 25, tall, handsome and educated, a racing driver with money, charm and the easy confidence of class. He moved through London's cocktail bars and country clubs like he belonged there, because he did. To Ruth he must have seemed like everything the war generation had been promised but never received: excitement, glamour and escape. They met through mutual friends, probably at one of the clubs she managed. He was already engaged to another woman, a fact Ruth either didn't know or didn't care to dwell on. Their affair was passionate and destructive from the start. He was possessive and often cruel. She was fiercely emotional and quick to react. Those who knew them said they argued as often as they reconciled. Ruth's friends noticed bruises, though few dared to intervene. Police reports from later interviews confirmed that violence went both ways, though the balance of power was never equal. David was the one with privilege and protection. Ruth had little more than her pride. By early 1955, their relationship had unravelled completely. Ruth discovered she was pregnant again, with David's child, but miscarried after what was described in court as a physical confrontation. It was never formally proven, but in the moral landscape of 1950s, Britain, such private matters were rarely discussed openly. The newspapers of the day hinted at it only obliquely, using phrases like a troubled romance or an emotional entanglement. The truth is they were trapped in a cycle of dependency, love mixed with resentment, affection tangled with humiliation. Ruth couldn't let go, and David didn't seem able to either. She followed him, called him, waited for him outside pubs and parties. He ignored her or shouted her away, depending on his mood. In those final weeks, her friends said she looked exhausted, pale, thinner, smoking constantly. One of them later told a reporter she was breaking apart, but you couldn't tell her that. She'd just laugh and say, "I'll be all right once he comes back." But he never really did. By Easter Sunday, 1955, whatever love remained between them had turned to ashes. And that's where the tragedy truly began. The Magdala still stands today, a smart-looking pub on South Hill Park in Hampstead, the sort of place you'd walk past without a second glance. On a sunny afternoon, it's all laughter and clinking glasses from the beer garden. But on Easter Sunday, 10th April 1955, the street outside was the scene of one of Britain's most infamous murders. When I came here, almost 70 years later, I stood where Ruth Ellis once stood. The road was quiet, the same tall plane trees lining the pavement, their branches swaying gently in the spring breeze. It's hard to picture the violence that took place here, but the old photographs leave no room for doubt. That afternoon, Ruth had been looking for David Blakely. She knew he'd been drinking with friends, first in a flat in Hampstead, then at the Magdala. Accounts differ slightly, but most agree she waited for him outside, dressed smartly as always, her platinum hair perfect, her handbag concealing a small .38 revolver. David emerged from the pub with a friend. When he saw her, he tried to avoid her, crossing the street quickly to reach his car. Ruth called out. He ignored her and kept walking. Witnesses said she called his name again, and then, without warning, she drew the revolver and fired. 5 shots. 2 hit him. 1 passed clean through his body. Another struck him in the back as he fell. He collapsed by the pavement near the door of his car. The sound echoed down the narrow street. A passing motorist ducked as a bullet ricocheted off the curb and shattered his windscreen. Ruth didn't run. She simply stood there, staring at what she'd done. When a bystander stepped forward to take the gun, she handed it over without protest. Her voice, calm but detached, carried across the street. "I am guilty," she said. "I'm rather confused." It was all over in moments. When the police arrived, she didn't resist. She was taken to Hampstead Police Station, where she gave a short statement before being charged with murder. There was no chase, no plea of innocence. In her mind and in the eyes of the law, the act was deliberate. Standing there now, outside the same pub, I found myself wondering what she must have felt in that instant. Fury, grief, despair, or perhaps nothing at all. The newspapers later called it a crime of passion. But in that quiet street on a spring evening, it felt more like an act of finality. For Ruth Ellis and for David Blakely, that moment outside the Magdala was the end of everything. Ruth Ellis didn't run, and that, in many ways, was what shocked people most. She didn't scream, didn't deny what she'd done. The first officer on the scene later testified that she was composed, eerily so. At Hampstead Police Station, she gave a brief statement. "I am guilty. I am a little confused." When asked if she understood the charge, she simply nodded. From that moment on, there was no question of mistaken identity or a frantic investigation. The case was as open and shut as any detective could wish for. But outside the walls of the police station, a very different drama began to unfold. By the following morning, newspapers across Britain had splashed her face across their front pages. Daily Express, News Chronicle, Evening Standard. They all carried the same image, a striking young woman with platinum blonde hair and a poised expression. Beneath the headlines, the word "murderous" appeared in bold type. To a country still steeped in traditional values, the combination of beauty, violence, and scandal was irresistible. The idea of a glamorous nightclub hostess gunning down a racing driver in broad daylight was almost cinematic. For editors, it was the perfect storm. Passion, class, and tragedy all rolled into one. Yet behind the headlines, the tone of the coverage was telling. The press described her not as a victim of circumstance, but as a woman who had overstepped society's limits. "She had everything a woman could want," one column wrote, "and she threw it all away for love." Others called her a cold-blooded blonde, echoing the language of American crime stories that were popular at the time. The public, too, seemed divided. Some were appalled, not by the crime itself, but by her composure. "She didn't cry, she didn't plead," one letter to the Times read. "A woman like that is dangerous." Others were fascinated, even sympathetic. Taxi drivers, barmaids, housewives. Everyone had an opinion. Within days, people began gathering outside Holloway prison where she was being held. Some came out of morbid curiosity, others to catch a glimpse of the woman who had done what most people only spoke about behind closed doors, acted on emotion and paid the price. Meanwhile, detectives worked quietly through the evidence. The revolver, the bullet casings, the eyewitness statements. It was, in their eyes, an open and shut case. She had confessed, the motive was clear, and there was no question of self-defense. The only real question left was how the court, and the country, would treat a woman who had done what Ruth Ellis had done. When I looked through the old reports, I noticed how quickly the tone of the press shifted. At first, fascination, then moral outrage. By the time her trial date was announced, the sympathy had drained away. She wasn't just on trial for murder. She was on trial for being the kind of woman who, in 1955, was never meant to exist. The trial of Ruth Ellis began on the 20th of June, 1955, at the Old Bailey. It lasted barely 2 days, but the ripples it sent through Britain would last for decades. When I visited Court Number 1, where the hearing took place, I tried to imagine what it must have looked like that morning. The same high ceilings, the dark wooden panelling, the echo of footsteps on the tiled floor, a place built to deliver judgment, not mercy. At the centre of it all stood Ruth Ellis, composed, elegant, and quiet. She wore a black suit, white blouse, and a small hat. No tears, no tremors, no attempt at self-pity. Just a calmness that unsettled even those defending her. The reporters noted it, of course. One headline read, "The Blonde Who Never Blinks." Presiding over the trial was Mr. Justice Havers, a stern, old-fashioned judge with little patience for theatrics. The prosecution was led by Christmas Humphreys, a man known for his precision and poise. On the other side, Melford Stevenson for the defence, competent but realistic. Even he knew the odds of success were slim. The facts were simple and tragically undeniable. Ruth had fired the gun. 2 bullets had struck David Blakely, killing him instantly. She had admitted it to the police. There were eyewitnesses. There was no dispute about what had happened. Only why? When Humphreys asked her in court what she had intended, when she pulled the trigger, she replied quietly, "It is obvious when I shot him I intended to kill him." It was a single sentence, clear, direct, devastating. In that moment, her fate was sealed. Under the law of 1955, intent was everything. There was no allowance for emotional turmoil, no legal concept of diminished responsibility. The Homicide Act that would later soften such verdicts was still 2 years away. Ruth's answer left no room for interpretation. The defense tried to present her as a woman driven by desperation, humiliated, heartbroken, and physically abused. But there was no evidence of madness, and the law required proof of insanity or self-defense to escape the noose. Neither applied here. The prosecution, meanwhile, painted her as cold and deliberate, a woman scorned who planned her revenge. They spoke of her waiting outside the pub, of the revolver hidden in her handbag, of the shots fired as Blakely tried to flee. The jury listened, grave-faced, their expressions unreadable. Ruth stood silently as witness after witness took the stand. She didn't look away. She didn't argue. She never once raised her voice. To some, that composure looked like dignity. To others, defiance. When the closing arguments ended, the jury retired. It took them no more than 20 minutes to reach a verdict. Guilty. Ruth Ellis, aged 28, was sentenced to death by hanging. As the judge placed the black cap upon his head, the courtroom fell silent. Reporters scribbled frantically. The clerk read the sentence in the same solemn tone used 4 centuries. "You will be taken from this place to a lawful prison, and thence to a place of execution, and there you shall be hanged by the neck until you are dead." Ruth bowed her head slightly and said, "Thank you." And just like that, it was over. 2 days, 5 bullets, 1 sentence. Outside, the crowd waited for news, expecting drama. There was none. Inside the Old Bailey, history had just taken its final step towards the gallows. After the verdict, there was no long wait. In 1955, the machinery of justice moved quickly, perhaps too quickly. Ruth Ellis was transferred to Holloway prison to await her fate. From the moment the sentence was announced, the public began to stir. At first, it was a murmur. Letters to the newspapers. a few concerned voices on the wireless. Then it grew louder. Within days, petitions began to circulate across London. People signed them in pubs, offices, and post offices. Some were motivated by sympathy, others by disbelief. Surely, one letter to the Evening Standard read, "We are not the kind of country that hangs a woman." Even some MPs voiced concern, arguing that the Home Secretary should intervene. But in 1950s Britain, mercy was a political act, not a legal one. The only person with the power to halt the execution was Gwilym Lloyd George, the Home Secretary, and he showed no sign of doing so. At the Home Office, officials reviewed the case files, read through the petitions and debated in private. The law was clear. Ruth Ellis had been convicted of murder with intent. There was no legal basis for clemency. She had not claimed insanity. She had not recanted. In their view, to spare her would be to undermine the justice system itself. But public opinion was shifting. Newspapers that had once printed her photograph beneath sensational headlines now began to question the morality of her execution. "Is this justice or vengeance?" asked one editorial. "Has the time come to end the gallows?" Outside Holloway prison, crowds began to gather. Some came to pray, others to protest. There were candles, hymns, and banners calling for mercy. Among the demonstrators were clergy, students, and ordinary Londoners, a reflection of a country beginning to question its own conscience. Inside the prison, Ruth's final days were marked by calm routine. She was described by the matron as polite, well-mannered, and resigned. She received letters daily, some from strangers, others from old friends, though few offered hope. When her solicitor visited to discuss the growing petition, she listened quietly, then said, "It won't make any difference. They won't stop it now." She was right. On 12th July, the day before the execution, the Home Office confirmed its decision. The plea for clemency had been rejected. The law would take its course. The following morning, the official notice was pinned to the gates of Holloway prison. The date and hour of execution were set. It would happen at 9 o'clock. And, as the city prepared for another summer day, a woman who had once been the face of post-war glamour now awaited her place in history, not as a celebrity, but as a symbol of a nation still wrestling with the meaning of justice. The morning of 13th July 1955 began quietly in North London. It was mild, still, and unremarkable, just another ordinary day. By 8 o'clock a small crowd had gathered outside Holloway prison. Some stood in silence, heads bowed. Others murmured prayers or watched the high brick walls with blank faces. Policemen kept order, though there was little need. The mood wasn't angry, it was heavy. At 9 o'clock, Ruth Ellis was led from her cell by Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's chief executioner. He was known for his professionalism, quick, quiet, efficient. To him this was a duty, not a spectacle. To the public it was history. Ruth had spent her last night writing letters. She was calm, composed, and polite to the end. The prison chaplain later said she showed no fear. She asked that her hair be neatly set, her nails polished, small acts of control in a world that had taken everything else. At exactly 9 o'clock, the execution took place. Within seconds, it was over. There were no witnesses beyond the officials required by law, no family, no friends, no last-minute reprieve. Outside the prison, a notice was pinned to the gates. Ruth Ellis was this morning executed in Her Majesty's Prison, Holloway. The crowd stirred, then fell silent. A woman fainted. A man shouted, "Murderers!" before being led away. For most, though, there were no words. Just the realization that they had seen the last woman in Britain go to the gallows. Within hours, the news broke nationwide. Radios carried the announcement at lunchtime. The evening papers sold out in minutes. Some headlines praised the firmness of the law, others questioned it. One editorial in the Manchester Guardian simply asked, "Was it necessary?" Ruth Ellis was 28 years old. She was buried within the prison walls, as the law required. For days afterwards, flowers appeared outside Holloway, left by strangers, many signed only with initials or single words. As the sun set that evening, London carried on as usual. Buses ran, shopkeepers closed for the day, and the city's heartbeat resumed its steady rhythm. But for those who stood outside those prison gates, the morning silence lingered, an unspoken understanding that something in the nation's conscience had shifted, even if few dared to say it aloud. In the days that followed Ruth Ellis's execution, Britain tried to move on, but the story refused to die. The newspapers, which had once fed on every detail of her life and trial, now shifted their tone. The sensationalism drained away. In its place came something quieter, more uncertain. "The law has been carried out," wrote the Times, "but few will feel triumph." Letters poured into newspaper offices from across the country, hundreds of them. Some condemned the hanging as a disgrace. Others defended it as justice done. But what stood out most was the unease. The case had unsettled people. For the first time in years, many began to question whether the gallows still had a place in modern Britain. At the Home Office, officials noted the reaction with concern. There had been no riots, no major demonstrations, only a steady, growing murmur of discomfort. People who had once supported the death penalty now found themselves hesitating. The idea of hanging a woman, and one who had acted out of heartbreak rather than cold calculation, seemed to many a step too far. In Parliament, a handful of MPs raised questions about the decision not to grant clemency. Why? They asked. Had there been no consideration of her mental state? Why had the Home Secretary been so quick to sign off the order? The answers were procedural, not moral. The law had been followed to the letter. But sometimes, following the letter of the law is what exposes its flaws most clearly. The British public, shaped by decades of post-war restraint and moral certainty, wasn't used to questioning authority. But Ruth Ellis's death opened a door that couldn't easily be closed. It became the case that people mentioned whenever another hanging was announced. Yes, but what about Ruth Ellis, they'd say. It lingered in conversation, in editorials, in conscience. For those who had covered the trial, including the reporters on the court benches, there was a sense of unfinished business. The story had ended, yes, but the feeling that something wasn't right remained. Years later, one journalist wrote, "I was there the day she was sentenced, and I still don't know whether we hanged a murderer or a victim of her time." In the pubs and clubs of London where Ruth had once worked, people spoke of her with a kind of quiet sadness. The glamour had faded, the outrage had dulled. What was left was pity, and a slow, collective realization that her story said as much about society as it did about her. Britain carried on, as Britain always does. But beneath the surface, the case of Ruth Ellis had begun to change the way people thought about justice, punishment, and mercy. It would take years for the law to catch up. As the years passed, Ruth Ellis's name refused to fade. Her case became more than a headline or a tragedy. It became a question Britain couldn't stop asking. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, calls to abolish the death penalty grew louder. The public mood had shifted. What had once seemed like justice now looked more like vengeance. The memory of a young woman, calm and composed as she faced the gallows, lingered in the national mind. Campaigners, lawyers, and politicians cited her case, time and again. If Ruth Ellis had lived a few years later, they argued, she would not have been hanged. They were right. In 1957, just 2 years after her execution, the Homicide Act was passed, introducing new categories of murder and recognizing diminished responsibility for the first time. Under that law, Ruth's emotional turmoil and abusive relationship with David Blakely might have spared her life. By 1965, capital punishment for murder was suspended in Britain, and 4 years later it was abolished altogether. Many historians still point to Ruth Ellis's case as the turning point, the moment when the country began to question not just how justice was carried out, but what it truly meant. For decades afterwards, the debate continued. Was Ruth Ellis a cold-blooded killer or a victim of circumstance? Did the courts fail to recognize the effect of years of abuse, humiliation, and despair? And why, in a world already changing so fast, did the state choose to make an example of her? In the 1980s, her case was re-examined. Her son André campaigned tirelessly to have her conviction reduced to manslaughter, arguing that she had been failed by the system and by those who were meant to defend her. His efforts brought renewed attention to the case, and although the conviction was never overturned, the court of public opinion largely agreed. Ruth Ellis had been treated unjustly. Modern historians now see her not as an icon of crime, but as a mirror, reflecting the gender, class, and moral tensions of her time. She was a woman trapped between eras, the glamour of post-war London on one side, and the unforgiving standards of a society that demanded women remain quiet, composed, and obedient on the other. Even today, nearly 70 years later, her story still resonates, not because of the crime itself, but because of what it revealed, about power, love, justice, and the human cost of certainty. When I revisited the archives for this piece, one note stood out to me. A small line in a forgotten newspaper editorial written the week after her death. It read, "We hanged Ruth Ellis, but in doing so, we condemned a little of ourselves." Perhaps that's why her story endures, not as a tale of guilt or innocence, but as a reminder that justice, when stripped of compassion, can become something far colder. And as I close my notebook, I can't help but wonder, if Ruth Ellis were alive today, would we understand her better? Or would we still be too quick to judge? It started as an ordinary day. It always does. A spring morning in 1955, a crowded London street, a woman in love and out of hope. By the time it ended, Britain had written another chapter in its long, uneasy story with justice. When I first began revisiting the Ruth Ellis case, I thought it would be a tale of crime and punishment, simple, final, neat. But it isn't. It's a story about people, about how emotion collides with law, and how society decides who deserves mercy and who does not. Walking past Holloway prison today, you'd never know what happened there. The old walls are gone, the ground has been redeveloped. There's no plaque, no marker, no memorial, just a quiet patch of North London, humming with ordinary life. But if you stand still long enough, you can almost feel the echo of it. That moment in time when the country looked at itself and began to wonder whether it had gone too far. Ruth Ellis didn't live to see that change, but perhaps in some way she helped to make it inevitable. As a reporter, I've spent years chasing stories of crime, punishment, and consequence, and what I've learned again and again is that the truth doesn't always sit neatly with the verdict. The truth lives in the space between, in the doubt, the discomfort, the questions we keep asking long after the case is closed. And maybe that's where Ruth Ellis still lives, in our uncertainty. Did justice prevail that July morning in 1955? Or did Britain lose a little piece of its humanity instead? I'll leave that for you to decide.